Hello everyone and welcome to History Azania. On this episode of our journey through South African history, we'll be covering the often forgotten Khoikhoi people of Southern Africa. Khoikhoi refer to a collection of tribes who lived in the western and northwestern portions of Southern Africa, primarily in what is now South Africa. The name translates directly to men of men or the real people. The Khoi and San people are often grouped collectively as the Khoisan. While San and Khoi groups frequently live side by side and sometimes share languages, it is useful to distinguish between the two. Khoi people were pastoralists who raised large herds of cattle and sheep, while the San were hunter-gatherers who relied on hunting wild game and gathering plants to supplement their diets. We now turn to the transformative shift that set them apart from other indigenous societies of the region. Let's now dive into the origins of the Khoi people. The Khoikhoi emerged as a distinct group approximately 2,000 to 2,000 years ago in the northern Kalahari region, in what is today Botswana and Zimbabwe. A defining moment in Khoi history came with the pastoral revolution, in which hunter-gatherer communities acquired fat-tailed sheep and cattle from neighboring Bantu-speaking groups to the north. This development fundamentally transformed their society, shifting it from egalitarian foraging lifestyle to one structured around livestock ownership and social stratification. A major migration followed, with the Khoi moving southward into present-day South Africa via two primary routes, one skirting along the west coast and another passing through the highveld. The introduction of cattle and the reliable food source they provided allowed the Khoi to form larger and more complex social groups than the region's original inhabitants, the San. The migration of the Khoikhoi was not merely geographic. It reshaped how they lived, organized themselves, and measured wealth. The Khoi lived in makihes, reed mat dwellings constructed of dome-shaped frames. These woven mats swelled during rain to become waterproof and contracted in heat to allow ventilation. In contrast to the San, Khoi society was hierarchical, with individual wealth measured by the size of one's livestock holdings. Khoi clans were led by hereditary chiefs or captains, often known as Bia or Kai Bia. Their authority was derived more from wealth, reputation, and consensus than coercion. Trade played a vital role in Khoi economic life. They engaged extensively with Bantu-speaking farmers, exchanging livestock for metal goods and agricultural products. Cattle and sheep were traded for iron and copper, which were used to manufacture weapons and ornaments. These social and economic systems would soon be tested by forces arriving far beyond the African continent. Long before the establishment of a permanent Dutch settlement in 1652, the Khoikhoi interacted with Portuguese, English, and Dutch mariners through a system known as relay trade. This early commerce centered on the exchange of Khoikhoi livestock for European goods such as iron, copper, and beads. Although these encounters were primarily commercial, they were frequently marked by tension over resources and cultural misunderstandings. One of the most famous early confrontations involved the Portuguese viceroy, Francisco de Almeida, who anchored his fleet at Table Bay while returning to Portugal from India. During an attempted trading exchange near the Salt River, a dispute escalated into violence. Seeking to punish the Khoikhoi and assert Portuguese military dominance, de Almeida led approximately 150 men ashore to attack a local settlement. Instead, the Khoikhoi used their deep knowledge of the terrain and domesticated animals as defensive tools. Armed mainly with stones and fire-hardened sticks, they overwhelmed the Portuguese forces. Francisco de Almeida and 65 of his men, including several high-ranking nobles, were killed. The defeat was so decisive that it sent shockwaves to the Portuguese Empire. For nearly a century, Portuguese and many other European ships largely avoided the Cape of Good Hope, viewing the Khoikhoi as formidable and the coastline as dangerous. For more than a century, the Cape remained outside European control. This geographical reality shifted in April 1652 when the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, under the command of Jan van Riebeeck, arrived at Table Bay. Their goal was not immediate colonization, but the establishment of a permanent refreshment station to supply Dutch fleets traveling between Europe and the East Indies with fresh water, meat, and vegetables. Over time, this led to the construction of a permanent fort and the gradual displacement of local Khoikhoi groups. The early VOC settlement relied heavily on indigenous intermediaries who possessed the linguistic and cultural fluency to operate between both worlds. Example of these is Ashumatu, a leader of the Amakwa tribe. Ashumatu was an experienced trader who had previously traveled to Java aboard an English ship, where he learned European languages and customs. He acted as a postmaster and diplomat for visiting ships, and later became a key trading partner for the Dutch. Ashumatu's niece, Krotoa, was taken into Jan van Riebeeck's household at a young age. She became fluent in Dutch and Portuguese and served as the VOC's chief interpreter. Living between two worlds, she played a critical role in high-level negotiations between the Dutch and her Khoikhoi relatives. The Khoikhoi-Dutch Wars were a series of armed conflicts later in the 17th century that ultimately resulted in the loss of independence for indigenous pastoral societies of the Cape. These wars were driven by a fundamental clash between the Dutch and Khoisan views of land ownership. Over nearly 2 decades of intermittent warfare, the Dutch employed superior weaponry and divide-and-rule tactics to systematically dismantle Khoikhoi political structures. The first major conflict erupts when the VOC under Jan van Riebeeck began granting land to Dutch farmers along the Liesbeek River. This area was essential to Khoikhoi's seasonal grazing cycles, and its enclosure for permanent agriculture effectively cut them off from vital pastures and water sources. Khoikhoi resistance was led by Nomoa, a former VOC interpreter who had witnessed colonial subjugation firsthand in Indonesia. Nomoa demonstrated strategic ingenuity by launching attacks during raining weather, knowing that Dutch muskets were ineffective when gunpowder became wet. The conflict ended in a stalemate, with the peace agreement concluded in 1660. However, the Dutch used this opportunity to consolidate position by planting a wild almond hedge to physically block Khoikhoi access to the Cape Peninsula. The second conflict was a Dutch war of expansion aimed at securing control over the interior and seizing large herds of livestock. It was triggered by the refusal of the powerful Khoikhoi group to trade cattle and their subsequent attacks on Dutch hunting parties. The Dutch exploited existing rivalries among Khoi groups, forming an alliance with the Chinokwa, who assisted VOC forces in tracking and raiding the Khoikhoi. The Khoikhoi leader, Gonima, waged a determined guerrilla campaign from the mountains. Despite this resistance, combined Dutch, Khoi forces eventually captured more than 5,000 heads of cattle and thousands of sheep, devastating Khoikhoi wealth. In 1677, Gonima was forced to sign a treaty of submission, agreeing to pay an annual cattle tribute to the VOC. The Obiqua-Sonko War functioned as the third phase of Dutch conquest. It involved resistance from San hunter-gatherers and displaced Khoikhoi refugees who had been driven from their lands. Dutch authorities ultimately suppressed this resistance by establishing military outposts and appointing compliant chiefs among defeated groups. Even sustained resistance could not shield Khoikhoi society from forces beyond the battlefield. While warfare was a primary driver of Khoikhoi political collapse, the smallpox epidemic of 1713 is often described as the final and most devastating blow. Introduced by contaminated linen from a Dutch ship that arrived at Table Bay in February 1713. The disease spread rapidly through the population with no prior immunity and no effective medical response. An estimated 90% of the Khoikhoi in the southwestern Cape perished during the initial outbreak. Smallpox struck at the core of Khoikhoi communal life. The deaths of chiefs, captains, and elders shattered existing leadership structures, making it impossible to reconstitute independent political units. Entire clans vanished, and many indigenous clan names were permanently lost. In colonial records, survivors were increasingly grouped under the broad and derogatory label Hottentots, rather than identified by their ancestral affiliations. This epidemic marked the end of independent Khoikhoi pastoralism in the Western Cape. Livestock was abandoned, stolen, or seized during the chaos. With land and cattle gone, survivors were forced to become landless herders and servants. As Khoikhoi communities disappeared, the Trek Boer farmers moved into the populated areas with official colonial support. The combined impact of war and disease laid the groundwork for a new phase of control, one enforced through law rather than arms. By the beginning of the 19th century, indigenous societies in the southwestern Cape were already in a state of near total collapse. stripped of land and livestock through war, theft, and disease. Khoikhoi survivors had little means of subsistence outside the colony. Many became landless laborers, working for the same farmers who now occupied their lands. Following the British conquest of the Cape, the Calderon Code was introduced to meet settler labor demands following Britain's abolition of the transoceanic slave trade in 1807. The law required every person classified as Hottentot to have a registered place of residence. Movement between farms or districts without a written pass signed by a master or magistrate was prohibited. Additionally, labor controls further intensified under Governor Sir John Cradock with the Apprentice Act of 1812. This legislation allowed farmers to apprentice Khoi and San children born on their farms, after being maintained until the age of 8. These children were legally bound to work without pay for an additional 10 years. These measures forced most Khoikhoi and San into a permanent underclass within colonial society. Although not legally enslaved, their lives were regulated through mechanisms commonly associated with slavery. By the mid-19th century, traditional social network and cultural institutions had largely been destroyed, leaving survivors scattered, dependent, and under white control. This system persisted until the passage of the Ordinance 50 in 1828, which repealed past laws and normally granted freedom of movement and land ownership. Though dispossession was nearly total, Khoikhoi identity did not vanish. It adapted and endured. Following the abolition of slavery in 1834, colonial authorities increasingly referred to emancipated slaves and landless Khoikhoi as the Cape Colored People. The 1911 census stripped numerous African communities of their specific identities, labeling them simply as colored. Under apartheid, the Population Registration Act of 1950 enforced this classification, rendering Khoikhoi and San ancestry politically and socially invisible. Indigenous languages were suppressed, while Afrikaans was imposed as the dominant language. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, many descendants of Khoi and San communities have initiated cultural and political revival. This movement represents a direct rejection of colonial and apartheid-era attempts to erase indigenous identity and history. A central focus of modern activism is land restitution. Contemporary Khoisan leaders challenge the limitations on the 1994 Land Restitution Act, which only recognizes land dispossession after the 1930 Native Lands Act and excludes earlier losses suffered by indigenous people of the Cape. Parallel efforts have been made to revive endangered indigenous languages. Institutions such as University of Cape Town's Khoi and San Center support research and revitalization of Khoikhoi languages. With community initiatives like XKFM Radio in the Northern Cape, broadcast in indigenous languages including the U and Khoi. Khoisan communities are also seeking official recognition of traditional leadership and historic clans, including the Namakwa, Griqua, and Hazikwa. Understanding this history, it allows us to reframe the Khoikhoi not as a vanished people, but as a living foundation. Far from being extinct, the Khoikhoi remain foundational to the cultural and genetic fabric of Southern Africa. Their legacy endures in place names, language, and ancestry, demonstrating their indigenous identity was never static, but resilient and adaptive. The history of the Khoikhoi is not merely an appendix to colonial expansion, but a story of endurance, resistance, and survival. By acknowledging their role as the first people to confront European settlements and sustain prolonged resistance, contemporary society can begin to address historical trauma and move towards a more honest and decolonized understanding of Southern Africa's past.